Will, which part of town do you live in?
East Central Phoenix.
Good morning, folks. If you're just joining us, thank you for joining us. We're going to wait maybe 3 more minutes, something like that, so others can join us as well. And then we will start the morning scoop today. Good morning, folks. Again, thank you for joining us. We're going to wait maybe 2 more minutes, something like that, and then we'll start. Morning, folks. We're going to wait just 1 more minute, and then we will start. All right. I think we are. It's a 1 in the morning. I think we are going to start. Good morning, everybody. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. The Arizona Capital Times, of course, covers state politics and public policy in Arizona. And if you don't have a subscription, please let me know. I'll get you squared away. You need it. Best thing you can give yourself today is a Capital Times subscription. We have a big subject this morning. We have lots of things to talk about, to flesh out, and to understand this landscape that we have. But first, I want to thank AARP Arizona for sponsoring today's morning scoop. AARP, of course, is the nation's largest nonprofit and nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people who are 50 years old and older so that they can choose how they live as they age. AARP has 38 million members, and it seeks to strengthen communities and advocates for what matters most to family, health security, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. The AARP Arizona chapter is the leading voice at the state capitol, advocating for the well-being of residents over 50. Among other things, the group has helped to formulate some of the biggest health policy decisions in our state. The work is far from over. As we all know, for example, AARP advocates for the population that is most at risk of complication from COVID-19. The gravity of that fact weighs heavily on the group, and in the last year and a half, its leaders have hunkered down to work, advocating for measures and steps to protect Arizona's most vulnerable citizens. Again, thank you, AARP Arizona, for sponsoring today's morning scoop. We have a great panel this morning. Joining us, my apologies, is Dana Marie Kennedy, who is the state director of AARP Arizona. State director for the organization representing more than 900,000 members. Dana works to make AARP Arizona a tireless advocate for Arizona's 50 plus and the issues that matter to them. As I mentioned, notably healthcare, employment security, and retirement planning. She recently testified, that was in 2020, in the U.S. House Ways and Means Subcommittee on examining the COVID-19 nursing home crisis. Before taking on the position of state director for AARP Arizona, Dana worked for then Congresswoman now U.S. Senator Kristen Sinema on issues of access to services for Arizonans in need of assistance. Dana is also the 2021 Woman of the Year in the Arizona Capital Times Women Achievers of Arizona Awards program. Dana, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Luigi. It's great to be here.
Also joining us this morning is Miranda Creviston-Matter, who serves as the Senior Vice President for State Affairs and Policy at America's Health Insurance Plans. In this role, she is responsible for AHIP's state policy and advocacy agenda, as well as its political engagement strategy with state officials, regulatory agencies, and key policymakers. Prior to joining the organization, Miranda served as the President and CEO of the Ohio Association of Health Plans, where she provided thought leadership on policy initiatives that drive improvements for access to high quality, affordable healthcare for the more than 9 million residents of Ohio covered by OAHP's 15-member health plans. Prior to her work at the organization, she practiced law for over 10 years, also in Columbus, Ohio. Miranda, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Luigi, for having me.
Also joining us this morning is Lee Purvis, who is the Director of Healthcare Costs and Access in AARP's Public Policy Institute, where she leads a team of policy analysts and researchers who work on healthcare issues that are relevant to the 50-plus population. She also heads the Institute's work on prescription drug issues and is a recognized expert on prescription drug pricing and coverage. She has testified on behalf of AARP and speaks frequently on a wide variety of prescription drug-related issues. She is also the co-author of the AARP PPI RX Price Watch reports, which have been tracking the prices of prescription drugs widely used by older Americans since 2004. Lee, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me.
Also with us is Will Humble, who is a longtime public health advocate in our state. He currently serves as the Executive Director of the Arizona Public Health Association. Will's more than 40 years in public health include more than 2 decades at the Arizona Department of Health Services, where he served in various capacities, including as a director from 2009 to 2015. Will holds a degree in marketing from NAU, a degree in microbiology from ASU, and a master's from the University of California at Berkeley. He was awarded an honorary doctorate of science from the U of A for engaging partnerships between academic and executive public health. He is a believer in using evidence-based health policy to improve health outcomes and in leading and managing with emotional intelligence. Will, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for the invitation, Luigi, and thank you for sponsoring AARP.
Like I mentioned, we have a great subject this morning. We have a great topic. There's a lot to talk about. We will attempt to answer a few key questions, notably, why are drug prices in America so high? What's keeping them high? What potentially are the solutions? Let me kind of set the landscape here. Prescription drug prices in America are roughly 2.56 times higher than in 32 other countries. That gap is a lot larger for brand name drugs. But unbranded generic drugs, for example, which are the bulk of the drugs sold in the US by volume, are actually, prices of them are actually lower than in most countries. So a couple other things. Some drug prices cost $1,000 a day. They include drugs that treat cancer and hepatitis, for example. Retail prices for about 180 widely used specialty prescription drugs increased by an average of 4.8% last year. In contrast, the general inflation last year was only 1.3%. Lee, tell us, why do we have this scenario that we have in the country today? And I guess the question is drug prices, are the drugs that we have on the market, are they accessible to people? To what extent are they accessible to people? And I guess I'm referring more specifically to those who may be underinsured, may not have insurance, because if you don't have insurance, you only pay a fraction of these prices, but you're still paying for them.
So that's a great question that unfortunately I get a lot from people who are really confused by what we're seeing in prescription drug price trends. And I actually have a very short answer, which is that there's really nothing in the US healthcare system to stop drug companies from setting these very high prices and then increasing them anytime they want. And that is a real contrast to a lot of other comparable countries in the world where they have taken action to try to stop those types of behaviors, but we haven't, and we're seeing the effects of that. That report that you mentioned is actually one that I wrote that focused on those 180 specialty prescription drugs. And I think another important point from that report is that on average, the price for one specialty drug that we looked at was $84,000 per year, which exceeds the US median income by about $20,000.
I'm sorry, did you say that the price of one drug alone is about $84,000?
One drug alone is $84,000 per year, which is frankly more expensive than houses in some parts of this country. And we're asking people to try to pay for those prices, oftentimes year after year. And I don't think anyone can afford those types of prices. So when you talk about accessibility, the reason that AARP is so engaged on this issue is that those prices aren't affordable, and they really are putting these drugs out of reach for people. And we are hearing from more and more of our members that they're having to make those tough decisions between paying for the prescription drug that they need and paying for other important things like paying for their rent or paying for food. And we don't think that's a choice anyone should have to make. But the reality is, because pricing behaviors have gotten so out of hand in this country, we are seeing more and more people facing those choices.
I want to go to Miranda. Miranda, Lee laid out a specific scenario which one drug costs $84,000 a year. And I'm presuming that if you're insured, well, I'm not presuming, if you're insured, you're only paying a fraction of that one. However, your insurance is still paying for the prices of the high prices of these drugs. From your point of view, I guess I'll ask you the same question. Why do you think the prices of drugs in our country are so high, especially if you compare them to the rest of the world?
Yep. So let me start off by saying, and Luigi, you said this, Lee said this, we can articulate a lot of stats and data. At the end of the day, we know drug prices are too high, and they're a top concern, right, for all Americans. And as you both said, we really don't have to look hard to find the data. We don't have to look long to find the statistics to, support this concern, right? We open up a newspaper and hear about a pharmaceutical company that raises a drug price, or listen to a news broadcast. So you can look at the healthcare spend, Luigi, which you cited this morning. You can look at health insurance costs. Today, 22% of every premium dollar in the commercial and the exchange marketplace goes to prescription drug spend. For seniors, it's 19%, so almost 20%. All of these things tell you, right, that drug prices are too high, and we have to do something about it. Lee talked about the terrible Hobson's choice that Americans have to make every day, right? Whether they buy necessities or they, go into the pharmacy counter and purchase the drug that they need for a better life or to live at all. We know that 1 in 4 Americans cannot afford their medications today. So one of the things that, I want to spend some little bit of time talking about today is what do we do about this, right? How do we fix this? How do we, quite frankly, incentivize and demand drug companies to lower their prices? I think, as Lee said, that we know that drug prices alone set prices. They decide how much those launch prices are going to be. They decide when and at what frequency they're going to increase those prices. And they do so without a regulatory structure in place. And in fact, it's really the current market. And I know we'll talk about some of those market reforms, but it's really the actual market that is allowing them to do that. When I look at this, I obviously look at this through the lenses of what can state policymakers do about this. Right? There's a lot of activity happening at the national level. We have to work hand in glove with those national efforts, whether it's patent reform, whether it's reforming and bringing more competition to the market for biosimilars. But at the end of the day, as policymakers in Arizona are looking at what they can do, one of the things I think that they have to do is stay laser focused on drug price accountability. Right. And, we'll probably talk more about this, the difference between price and cost. Health insurance is but a reflection of what it costs to purchase healthcare and pharmacy care. And so as drug costs increase, health insurance costs have to reflect that. Quite frankly, regulators demand that of health insurance. And so, we really think that state legislators can arm residents with more information about drug prices. We really think that this can empower them. Information is power. We know that. And it can really help them understand why the drug they're taking costs a certain amount, what research and development looks like for that drug, what marketing looks like for that drug to make better informed decisions about their pharmacy care.
It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to go to Will. It seems to me that we set up a system in which we set up the system so that we can, it's almost like we don't have a whole lot of choice. We're going to have high prices because of the way the system is set up. I want to point just really quickly that the other countries, they have regulatory frameworks that allow their governments to then negotiate the price of drugs before they enter the market. Will, your thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Luigi. I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. We are allowing ourselves to get ripped off by the drug companies. We've been allowing it for decades. And there's a fundamental flaw in the system. There's many flaws in the system, but a fundamental flaw is that Medicare, the biggest payer of healthcare, Medicare is unable to negotiate with drug companies on the price of name brand drugs. Now think about that. That's like you having to buy a car at a single dealership, and that's the only place you can go. And whatever you walk in the door, the price is the price, and there's no negotiating, and there's nowhere else to go. That's just wrong. And it's not just ripping off everyday consumers and seniors in Medicare Part D and but it's ripping people off in the other parts of the system because, as Miranda said, those prices are reflected in the private health insurance that we pay, and which is one of the reasons why your premiums keep going up year after year. And it's also really endangering the Medicare trust fund that you see in your payroll taxes that come out if you look at your paycheck, you see the FICA and you see Medicare. That part of that is paying these exorbitant prices for these name brand drugs. And so I'm a big fan of market-based solutions for things. And there's the simple market-based solution, which is to allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices with drug companies. They have a monopoly right now. Why would we allow that? But we have for decades. We've allowed a monopoly to exist, which is causing, not the only reason for these high prices, but it's a big reason for it. And fortunately, we do have a solution that's on the table. In the next couple of months, I think is going to determine what happens in the next probably 10 years with respect to drug prices, because the president's Build Back Better plan includes a provision that would allow Medicare to negotiate prices, and it would allow those prices to be used in the private health insurance plans, which would help slow down the rising costs of private health insurance. It would help out the Medicare trust fund and bring us closer to what the other, say, for example, European democracies in Japan, the OECD countries pay for drugs. And so one of the provisions that's in the bill would be that private health insurers could benefit from, I think, paying the same price that Medicare pays, or Medicare negotiates with drug companies. Now, there's two potential solutions, and I'll stop talking, but I just want to introduce the two ideas. One is what's called HR 3, and that is a bill that the House of Representatives has already passed, actually a couple of years ago, that would allow Medicare to negotiate the prices of between 25 drugs and 125 name brand drugs, and allow them to negotiate. And there's some safeguards to make sure that the negotiations are fair. There's also penalties in place so that if the drug companies don't negotiate fairly, there's some sanctions that the federal government can use. And that's a good start. The president's proposal is that Health and Human Services, Medicare, be allowed to negotiate the prices of all name brand drugs. And I think that is a better solution, because at first I was a big fan of HR 3, and I do think that's a good start. But if you think about what the drug companies could end up doing is, let's say next year, Medicare negotiates drug prices on 100 drugs. Well, and they get a better price. Well, what's to stop the drug companies from saying, well, okay, here's a brand new list of 100 drugs that we're going to rip you off on.
Right.
And since
Right.
you've already reached your cap, you can't negotiate anymore. That's why I like the president's plan better.
Thank you for that, Will. And we will flesh that out in more detail in a little bit. But I wanted to go to Dana. Dana, what are you hearing from your membership? What are you hearing from your constituents? What kinds of problems have manifested as a result of the regime that we have?
I have a couple of examples of members who have reached out to us regarding their high cost of prescription drugs. Gloria, who's 70 years old, she's diabetic, and she's paying $474 every 15 days for her medications. She's had to come out of retirement in order to pay for her prescription drugs. I don't think that anybody should have to come out of retirement because they just happen to have diabetes. We have another member, Carol, who also is 70 years old, who's reached out to us. She's got psoriasis, and her medications are $2,500 4 times a year. That's $10,000 in medication costs. And these are just examples of people who are just saying, I can't afford this any longer. I mean, how long can you sustain it? And we need to make sure that, we're able to get them the lowest cost. We are coming out with a survey next week, but just a few top lines. 94% of voters in Arizona, these are just voters in Arizona, 94% believe that Medicare should be able to negotiate. 88% say Congress needs to do something now and not wait. 65% believe that somebody that they know, either themselves or a family member, are not going to be able to cover the cost of their prescription drugs. We have been advocating strongly. We are, our members are flooding Senator Sinema's, phones, not only in DC, but also in Phoenix. They have written thousands of emails advocating. We have personally reached out to Senator Sinema's office to ask for a meeting. It came out that she did not support Medicare to negotiate. We want her to walk us through why she doesn't support that. We talked to her staff yesterday. They said right now she's a no, but she's open to learning more. So we're glad that she's open to learning more. But, like many people, we believe that we want to meet with our senator, hear why she isn't supporting allowing Medicare to negotiate when 94% of constituents in the state of Arizona believe that Medicare should be able to negotiate.
And Dana, when you mentioned the cost of medication that some of your members have had to pay for, are we talking about out of pocket expenses, right? We're talking
Correct.
about them paying $2,500 a year for a medication.
Correct. And it depends on what plan they chose. Many we let our members know, that the area agencies on aging, have a program to be able to walk them through what the best price is. But even if they select a plan, then they can get switched, in the middle of the year. And that's just not right. We need to have better protections. If you do your due diligence and figure out what the best plan for you is according to the medications that you take, and then you get switched in the middle of the year, but yet you can't find another plan, that's just wrong. So these are just examples of things that we're advocating for our members.
I want to pause here for a second and just ask our viewers and our listeners, if you do want to ask questions, please do so. Send them via the Q&A the Q&A room, or rather enter them via the Q&A chat box or the chat box itself. I hope I'm making sense. It's early in the morning. I did have 2 cups of coffee already. Lee, when we were doing our prep call yesterday, you mentioned that I think it's important to differentiate between cost and price. Tell us what is cost and what is price, and why is that this distinction important?
So I would say price is what's most important, because to Miranda's point, that is what's driving cost. The cost is what we look at, for example, your out-of-pocket costs. So that co-insurance, that flat co-payment that you're paying every month, or co-insurance where you're paying a percentage of the drug's price. Those are the costs. And what we've been seeing a lot lately are attempts to limit costs, which is completely justifiable and understandable, because to Dana's point, we are seeing some people who are paying some very high out-of-pocket costs. But if you only address the cost, you aren't addressing the underlying problem. And that's kind of like squeezing the balloon. where you may see lower out-of-pocket costs at the pharmacy counter, but the price has been unaddressed and will keep growing. And that ultimately is going to lead to higher healthcare premiums, higher healthcare costs down the road. So it's a short-term fix. And that's why AARP, I'm sorry.
I was saying, why is that? Why will it lead to, in the long term, increased prices? If I'm looking at this from, let's say, for example, from a purely selfish standpoint, I go to the pharmacy, I only pay a fraction of whatever the price is, and it's manageable on my end. How does that over time not actually help me?
So going back to what Miranda said at the beginning of the hour, your insurance company is paying the rest of that price. And that is being built into your premiums, your cost sharing, your deductibles, your out-of-pocket limits. All of those will reflect that full price. So even if you personally are benefiting at that pharmacy counter by having a lower cost, because the underlying problem, which is the price, has not been addressed, you're ultimately going to see those higher costs down the road. And our biggest concern is that ultimately, if those premiums get high enough, it can actually make coverage unaffordable. So again, only addressing part of the problem is not enough, because the root of the problem is actually the drug's price.
Miranda, I want to go to you. I think you were going to jump in there. Go ahead now.
No, and just to lean in a little bit on what Lee said, she is exactly right. And, again, as we think about proposals at the state level, it is, I can't overstate, I should say, how incredibly important it is as legislators are looking at policy proposals to ask that question. Is this proposal getting at the underlying cost of the drug, or is this proposal merely a short-term fix, right? So we're getting at the insurance cost. Lee is exactly right. If that proposal is the latter, and it is, let's say, for example, a cap on insulin copays, which we know has been explored in the Arizona legislature, and I would say I applaud state policymakers for pausing and really wanting to understand what impact that will have. But at the end of the day, that cost pressure will be seen somewhere else in the price of that product. And as I said, it is a regulatory requirement that that price has to be reflected somewhere else in the product. And it's really important for consumers, right, patients to understand that. I would go back to the example of the insulin copay cap. So, quite frankly, we know that drug companies across the country, so it's not just in Arizona, but across the country, have been advocating either directly or indirectly for that kind of a solution, right? Mainly because at the pharmacy counter, it provides relief, but it doesn't provide relief for all residents in the state of Arizona. It doesn't provide relief for that small business owner who is doing everything they can to make sure that they can continue to afford healthcare and pay for healthcare for their employees. For that individual who is trying to make sure that they stay insured for their family, right? These are the impacts when they get that surprise premium bill in the mail. That's going to be the impact. Again, let's go back to the copay cap on insulin. While drug manufacturers have been advocating this across the country, let's take a look at what they have done in terms of insulin prices. Drug manufacturers have raised the price of insulin by more than 200% over the past, decade, and prevented generic competition for more than 90 years. So at the same time, while they're advocating for these at-the-counter pharmacy insurance costs reductions intentionally, let me say, they are at the same time increasing their insulin prices. And I think that puts a finer point on when you mask the insurance price, you are really masking what they're going to do to the underlying cost and price of that drug. And in fact, we're actually, potentially encouraging them to raise that price because it's not being felt at the pharmacy counter. You don't have that public outcry at the pharmacy counter because that price of this life-saving, right, drug that somebody needs to live every single day may be mitigated. At the end of the day, it costs everybody more, and everybody's health insurance coverage and access to coverage is jeopardized.
Will, you were nodding your head. You've been in this arena 40 years. Obviously, we have there are solutions that are being offered at the federal level. whether they're the right solutions or the wrong solutions, that's what we're having this conversation, and that's why we're having this debate in the national level. However, we do have policymakers at the state level, and I wonder, Miranda talked about approaching this, confronting this issue at the state level. What can state policymakers do, both in the short term and in the long term, to confront this issue, in your mind?
Well, I got to tell you, Luigi, my wheelhouse is at the federal level on this one, and that's where I've been focusing my attention, because we have a national systemic problem, a fundamental flaw in the way that these drug prices are set. And you're right, price is not cost. And so I've been just focusing my attention on what we can do at the national level. And now is the exact, if we don't get drug price reform done now, I'm afraid it's going to be many, many years before another opportunity comes up.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think now is the opportunity? If we don't do it this year, then
well, because of it's a proposal in the Build Back Better plan. It is a cost savings. One of the offsets of everyone keeps talking about the $3.5 trillion over 10 years thing that's in Build Back Better. One of the cost offsets to pay for that, part of the pay for is tax increases on the wealthy and so forth. Part of the pay for is the savings that the federal government achieves by actually negotiating with the drug companies on price. So that's the offset. But to go more directly to your question, what can we do in state? I think the biggest lever is Medicaid. So access, actually, just as we've said, Medicare can't negotiate, but Medicaid isn't subject to the same restrictions that Medicare is. And so our state Medicaid agency has a formulary process. They have rebates that they're able to get from the drug companies, depending on how they negotiate the formulary with the companies. And so we are negotiating at the state level through our state Medicaid agency, and they get far better results from the drug companies than Medicare does. And somebody in the chat box put in that the VA, Veterans Administration, is allowed to negotiate with the drug companies. And they say in the chat box, and I presume this to be true, that they're paying 40% less than Medicare. So the big macro reform is in front of us right now. And I just hope that this gets through, because, and you said, why do I think it's not going to happen after this? It hasn't happened. People have been talking about the need for Medicare to be able to negotiate for the last 20 years. And I'll just say it, the drug companies have a chokehold on Congress through their campaign contributions to their PACs and so forth. And they're all afraid to go against the cash cow of the drug companies. And now we finally got a critical mass close to it. If we could get Senator Sinema on board to build this into the overall package and at least get the HR 3 part of it done. I could live with that. That's not the best solution because it limits their negotiation to just 125 drugs. But at least it's a start, and it's far better than it is right now. And it will be good for Medicare beneficiaries. It'll be very good for regular private insurance people, because the private insurance companies could benefit from that Medicare negotiation price. And it's good for taxpayers that in their payroll taxes every 2 weeks are paying into the Medicare fund, the trust fund. So I don't know. I'll stop talking because
and thanks for that.
Other people's time.
Yeah, I wanted to go to Dana, because Dana, obviously there are things that we can do at the state level. Yeah, and I do wonder what are some of the things you would like to do next year. If you have the opportunity to do something significant to confront the prices of medication.
I mean, I think that Will, hit it on the head, is allow Medicaid to also negotiate and be able to lower costs. And I think that we also need to look for transparency and how are we doing our pricing right now? And what else can we do at the state level to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable? And we know that other states have been able to work to be able to re-import drugs from other countries. That's also another option. So I think we have several tools in our toolbox Do we have the will this legislative session? I think it's going to be, or this next upcoming legislative session, I think it's going to be a little bit of a challenge. With how many people are actually running for other offices, so many new members. But I think that, we're still engaging in the process of talking to legislators to see who may have the political will to work with us to be able to develop some legislation, to be able to get some good public policy through.
Lee, I wanna go through a couple of the arguments against H3, for example, HR3, and the idea that maybe we should have a regulatory regime that negotiates the prices of drugs before they hit the market. Among them is that private R&D within the pharmaceutical industry will get reduced significantly, and as a result that means new drugs coming to the market will also reduce. What do you think of that?
So I certainly hear that argument a lot. And I think it's really important for people to keep in mind that the vast majority of important new drugs that have been introduced in the past 60 years were developed with the aid of research that was conducted by the public sector, meaning that taxpayers are actually contributing towards some of the really big drugs that have come on the market. And they actually do a lot of that basic research that ultimately translates into new drugs. Something else that's really important to keep in mind is drug companies spend a lot of money on things other than R&D. It's generally around less than 20% of their revenues being spent on R&D. So we have to be mindful that there's a lot of excess money, let's say, floating around in that system. So I think it's pretty safe to say, and research has borne out, that they could see some reductions in those revenue, and R&D would be perfectly capable of continuing.
So, some of the stats that I've seen, for example, say that the pharmaceutical industry invested 130 billion in 2018 in medical and health R&D. Federal government, for example, only spent 43 billion. So again, to the point, the potential that it would inhibit R&D investment, and therefore it would inhibit new drugs coming to the market, new research that would potentially save the lives of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people.
I think something else that's important to keep in mind when we see numbers like that is that R&D numbers are what they say they are, but we don't really know what they are. There's not a whole lot of transparency when it comes to what R&D represents. It could be, for example, looking for new companies to acquire and acquiring their products, which is actually something that a lot of big drug companies are heavily engaged in now. We're often seeing drugs being developed by these smaller drug companies that are ultimately kind of snatched up by these bigger drug companies. So if you're qualifying that as an R&D cost, I'm not sure it's necessarily on par with the type of research that NIH is funding, which is that basic research that, again, ultimately is what's being translated into these new drugs.
Miranda, I want to ask you, because among the arguments is the potential that it will also inhibit the profit motivation of pharmaceutical companies. Now, profit isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's allowed for innovation and all kinds of things that we enjoy today. I saw one statistics basically say that this proposal will probably reduce the global pharmaceutical revenue by about 19%, 20%. If that's the case, then again, to the point, less R&D, less new drugs to the market, less innovation, fewer capabilities, if you will, to tackle emerging health problems.
So let me say this, Luigi, we strongly believe that, more competition will really drive affordability. It will continue to drive innovation. And it will really drive accessibility for Americans to, the availability of drugs. What that means, right, is how do we make an anti-competitive or a dysfunctional market more competitive? We know that there are a number of things that have to happen at the federal level, whether it's patent reform. Again, I think we all can bring, stories and anecdotes to the table about issues that we've seen with patents, right? We've got to make sure that, drugs can come to market quickly, right? And all of those things, we believe with that competition, with more drugs, with more choice, with more accessibility, will ultimately drive affordability. Again, I can't, I continue to focus on what state legislators can do with respect to this, right? There are things that they can do to actually bring more competition and encourage competition at the state level. I know we all.
What are your examples?
Sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but name one or two that, Arizona legislature can perhaps do next year.
Yep. So one example would be to, look at state policies and remove any barriers to encourage value-based pricing in pharmacy care.
Sorry, what is value-based pricing?
So value-based pricing is you're paying for an outcome that a drug will provide, right? You're not paying for, essentially, it's very similar to when you think about this in the medical space. You're paying for an outcome as opposed from paying for a service, right? So to really embed efficacy into, prices and cost is something that, state legislators can do. They can think about, they can actually drive through, different policies that they want to advance. The other really clear example, and I know I keep going back to copay caps or legislation, quite frankly, that mandates coupons, right? Like those are things that when you actually look at the behavior behind it, is creating an anti-competitive market. It's allowing a drug manufacturer to continue to increase prices, to continue to keep their sliver of the market. And those are all things that state legislators can do. All the while, the national conversation is happening at the federal level around patent reform, about exclusivity, about what needs to be done to bring biosimilars to the market quicker. There are clear things that, quite honestly, state legislators either can do proactively, or things that they can restrain themselves from doing. Let me give one more example. And I know it's not one that we think about, but things like utilization management tools, things like prior authorization or step therapy, those are real tools for patients. Those are patient tools in terms of efficacy. Those are patient tools in terms of, for them to understand what the financial liability for a drug will be. And those are all things that I think we don't really think about in terms of making sure that those tools are available. But quite frankly, lots of times, if you look in the back of the room of a state capitol hearing room, the pharmaceutical industry is very, very interested in those kinds of provisions, because anything that gives them unfettered access to a patient with a high-priced drug is something that they are very interested in.
Lee, what are
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah,
I was just going to say, can I go back to that innovation argument? Because that's something that I have heard for well over a decade at this point. And I want to make sure that people understand kind of what's happening in the pharmaceutical market. And I should be clear at the outset, AARP fully appreciates the importance of innovation. Obviously, our members use a lot of prescription drugs. We want innovation to continue. But a lot of what we're seeing right now, I think a lot of people would describe as innovation in name only. For example, about 75% of recent patents are for existing drugs, meaning they've been recycled or purposed. They're not for new drugs. Researchers also indicated that only about a third of new drugs in the past decade have provided any benefit beyond existing drugs that would be qualified as moderate or better. So we are seeing new drugs. I think there is a question as to whether or not a lot of people would define those as innovative. And a lot of the solutions that are on the table would actually help move us in the right direction, because if you have these competitive markets where you're actually looking at the drugs and looking at the benefits they provide and negotiating, that sort of information is what drug companies will ultimately use to make decisions about future drugs, and you can actually see more innovation. So it's really important to keep in mind, we may not have exactly a high bar on innovation right now. So the idea of changing things could actually improve the types of drugs that we see coming on the market.
Dana, I want to go to you just really quickly, ma'am. As I was thinking about this, the proposal before Congress is to allow Medicare to negotiate the prices of drugs, between 25 and 125, something like that. why only Medicare? Because obviously, if you only have Medicare, it benefits a certain section of society. It doesn't necessarily benefit everybody. I want to get your thoughts on that one.
So the question is, why only Medicare? We're focused on Medicare right now. Well, because of the Medicare Modernization Act that was passed that doesn't allow Medicare to negotiate. So we need to go back and fix that. This is unfinished business for AARP. So they supported the Medicare Modernization Act back in the 20s, which was George W. Bush's signature legislation, but it didn't allow Medicare to negotiate. So that's the reason why we're kind of focused on that right now, is we're
Because
trying
the vehicle is available for such an advocacy.
Right.
Here's another question. And perhaps Miranda, perhaps Will can answer this one. Some of the PBMs are associated with or owned by insurance companies, for example. Is there a problem in terms of conflict of interest that may be driving the prices of drug up? Will or Miranda?
That sounds like a Miranda question to me.
Go ahead, Miranda. Go ahead, Miranda.
No, so let me say and sort of take a step back on pharmacy benefit managers, right? And remembering why pharmacy benefit managers, quite frankly, were created in the first place. They were created in the first place because drug prices were too high, right? And the reality is that pharmacy benefit managers serve an important role. They negotiate on behalf of Americans. They stand in the shoes and drive down those prices for Americans so that they can afford their pharmacy care. And so, understanding, I think, their role and why they were created in the first place is incredibly important to this drug price conversation. They, provide a really important service to not only health plans, but they provide an important service to employers, both fully and self-insured, that utilize PBMs, and ultimately they are providing better, more affordable pharmacy care for individuals all across this country.
What about the conflict of interest argument against the regime that we have, in which PBMs are owned by insurance companies? Just really quickly, ma'am.
Sure. So again, many health plans utilize PBMs either internally or externally, using an organization to help them better derive and get better prices from drug manufacturers is something that they ought to be doing. At the end of the day, this is about affordability of drug costs and drug prices for the Americans that they are serving each and every day. They, again, provide important services, whether it's, care management, claims processing. I mean, there's an entire sort of scope of services that PBMs provide, and it's a really important service, both from a care management and a price negotiation perspective.
Dana, ma'am, you commissioned a survey recently about, I think you mentioned them earlier on, about Arizona's attitudes toward the high price of medication. Can you flesh out some of the major points of this survey?
I mentioned it earlier. So we did commission a survey. We're releasing it next Monday. So we're still going through all the data. But the top lines are that 94% of Arizonans, and these were all Arizonan voters, believe that Medicare should be able to negotiate. 65% believe that them or somebody they know will not be able to afford their medications. 86% believe that Congress needs to take action in passing some meaningful legislation to be able to help them. So that's kind of a sneak preview. We're not going to release all the information because it's going to be released on Monday.
Right. And then do let us know as soon as that's available. us at the Capital Times. When you see this very high numbers, what does it mean in terms of your ability to advocate for the policies that you're advocating right now, either at the state level or at the congressional level?
That's a great question, because obviously we paid for this. We paid OHPI to do the survey. 800 voters were surveyed. So that's a fairly significant amount of voters. But it gives us data to be able to say, this is where we are. And you should be listening to your voters, your constituents, and what they feel and what they want and what they believe Congress should be doing. So they do believe that Congress needs to take action, and they believe that they need to take action now. I think 68% are currently taking medication, and so they are consumers. And so I think that, elected officials should be listening to their constituents rather than, the pharmaceutical industry, where they're taking a lot of resources, a lot of money for their campaigns.
Lee, is this research study, this poll that we've done in Arizona, is this replicated nationwide? Is this what you're seeing elsewhere, other parts of the country?
Absolutely. This is definitely a nationwide phenomenon, and the numbers are always, in terms of agreement, always approaching 90% for a wide variety of solutions. It's really clear that this is an issue that resonates with Americans of all ages. And when I'm speaking about it publicly, I always like to point out, given the state of our country, it is very hard to identify an issue on which there is such a high level of bipartisan agreement, which really just indicates how much people, or how strongly people feel about this issue and how much it's affecting them. And the reality is, hopefully, that politicians will be listening.
Yeah, and Luigi, if I could just add one more thing, is regarding, who we did survey. We made sure that we surveyed the actual, constituents in Arizona. So it is so many Republicans, so many independents, and so many Democrats. So like Lee said, this has tremendous bipartisan support. They do not care what political party you are coming from. They believe that they need to take action, our elected officials who are representing them.
Thank you. Will, here's a question for you. Help me understand. The federal law expressly prohibits Medicare from negotiating drug prices or making decisions about which drugs it should cover. And correct me if I'm wrong, Medicare is required, I think, to cover pretty much all the drugs that the FDA approves. Is that right? Why is this the case?
Well, Dana mentioned it about 10 minutes ago. It's in the Enabling Act for Medicare, and it goes all the way back to the first George Bush, where the reforms came in, and Medicare was prohibited from doing those negotiations and has been prohibited ever since. It's caused the Medicare trust fund to be depleted faster than it otherwise would have. It causes folks in Medicare Part D to pay more than they should have to pay at the pharmacy counter. It costs the Medicare Advantage plans more, and so the premiums are more. It costs across the entire system. Private health insurance is paying more than it should because of this fundamental flaw that prohibits the biggest buyer of drugs from being able to negotiate. And it's a market-based solution. I mean, that's the thing is, this should be, and it is bipartisan, as you said, Dana, not with elected officials who get their money in their campaigns for the drug companies because they're afraid to irritate the people because they may not get more money next time and have formed a cozy relationship with them. But look, it's a market-based reform. Adam Smith's invisible hand works. It works. If you negotiate, you can get better prices and better performance and better results. And right now we have a system that prohibits competition. It prohibits negotiation. It's un-American, quite honestly.
And if Luigi, if I could just add one thing, if you're a fiscal conservative, this saves billions of dollars for Medicare, billions. And so I don't understand why anybody would be against allowing Medicare to save billions of dollars.
Dana or Will or Lee, what is the main obstacle right now? Where are we at with this legislation before Congress, and what's preventing it from quite frankly from getting passed? I know it's probably a pretty overarching question, but can you pinpoint to something that's the main obstacle?
That's a hard one. I think that, we really need to put pressure on Senator Sinema. If she is telling, the White House that she's against allowing Medicare to negotiate, then I would say that that's one of the obstacles. And that's a tough pill to swallow, to tell you the truth. It's like, a lot of people worked really hard, and that was an issue that she put at the center of her campaign to lower drug costs. And so she has an opportunity to do that to fulfill that promise that many voters voted for her in office. So, let's be open and let's really look at why are we opposed to allowing Medicare to negotiate.
Lee?
I would say it kind of goes back to some of your questions earlier, dealing with research and developments and innovation and this wide variety of scare tactics that pharma has been deploying every single time there's been any talk about addressing drug prices. Unfortunately, those arguments are effective if people have not been necessarily informed about how that market is actually operating. And it really is important for people to also understand that negotiation and other efforts to address drug prices are going to help everyone. I think that also kind of gets lost in these scare tactics. Innovation, that it'd be a real shame if we didn't cure Alzheimer's type of, messages that are trotted out every time we have this discussion. You also have to be careful to think about, we really, going back to your original point about access, we really are having people who can't afford the prescription drugs that they need. And these types of efforts will help them. It will help everyone with healthcare coverage because these prices are being built into their premiums and their healthcare costs. It will help all taxpayers because taxpayers are paying for public programs that pay for prescription drugs. So these are solutions that really benefit everyone. And these scare tactics, unfortunately, are what are kind of getting in the way.
Miranda, your thoughts, ma'am?
So as I said before, we certainly agree with the problem, right? The problem is the high cost of drugs. And we certainly agree, I agree with Lee and Dana in terms of what the end objective is, right? The end objective is to get consumers, whether you're a senior, whether you're an employer, whether you're an employee, an individual purchasing on the exchange marketplace, more affordable pharmacy care. What we believe, though, is that we need to really look at what the market looks like and restore competition to that market. We believe more drugs, more competition will ultimately drive affordability. And, as I said, there are real things that we need to look at the national level. We need to look at patent reform. We need to look at the abuses that are currently taking place. We need to look at the pathways that, biosimilars have to go through to be deemed interchangeable. We need to do all of those things to restore competition to the marketplace. And what we believe is that restoring that competition through private industry is the pathway to bring better affordability for all Americans, whether you're seniors, whether you're, again, employers that are trying to continue to provide healthcare to your employees, or individuals that are purchasing this on your own. We believe that private industry is the way to restore that competition in the marketplace.
Will?
I couldn't agree with Miranda more. She said it perfectly. That was super articulate. I agree completely. And the issue is that the market forces aren't working correctly now because the pharmaceutical industry has written the rules and they have purchased the lawmakers that are making the decisions. And so we've got to get past the point where the decisions are being made in Congress as a result of the campaign contributions that have been flowing into their coffers and get to the place where lawmakers are acting on the behalf of their constituents rather than the people that are funding their campaigns. And so those things Miranda talked about were absolutely crucial. And the big elephant is Medicare. And that's the opportunity that we have right now. And I'm just crossing my fingers that we're able to achieve this because, like I said at the beginning, if we don't get it done now, God help the Medicare Trust Fund because it's going to get depleted and people are just going to, the prices going faster than inflation are just going to continue to go. I just really believe this is the moment in time where we have an opportunity to finally get this done. And we've been waiting more than 30 years for this kind of reform. We'll see if it happens in the next couple. Much will depend on what Senator Sinema decides.
I want to go to some of our audience questions just really quickly. Here's one from Rich. What role does the very lengthy patent protections given to companies when they introduce new drugs sustain the high prices they can charge? And how do they use this protection in ways to protect their profits, their shareholders' bottom line? I guess, Lee, maybe you can take on this question.
Yeah, patents are definitely a hot topic at the moment. I think when most people think of patents, they think, oh, you get a 20-year term to protect your monopoly, and then, competition starts. And unfortunately, that's not the way it's happening right now. We're seeing drug companies engage in a lot of behaviors that help extend those monopoly periods. There's something called patent thicketing, where they patent everything they possibly can. A drug you probably heard of is Humira. It has over 250 patent applications for it. It is something that they're using, and that helps prevent competition because you can't enter the market until all of those patent issues or patents have expired. We're also seeing things like evergreening, where they're tweaking a product and getting additional monopoly period that way, or product hopping, where you're making another little tweak to the product and then shifting the whole market to this new product that has a longer patent period left. There's just a lot of, I call them shenanigans, taking place in the market around patents. And that's why there's so much interest in trying to find ways to stop some of those really, frankly, inexcusable behaviors that drug companies are engaging in to keep their monopolies and their prices high as long as possible.
Miranda, perhaps we can answer this question. And I don't know the validity of the question, but I'll ask it anyway. Medicare negotiating with, this is from Joan, Medicare negotiating with any individual is not a balanced negotiation. Decisions that both the agency and the company may need to make can limit access to patients. We have seen this in other countries with single payer systems where these negotiations, quote unquote, take place. Your thoughts?
So I'm going to, Luigi, I apologize. I'm going to have to ask you to restate the question.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, sorry. So here's
negotiation. Yeah.
One question from Joan. Basically, she's saying that having a state agency or a federal agency or any government agency negotiate individually with a company, a drug company, it's not going to produce a balanced negotiation. That decisions that they make may, in fact, limit access to patients. And Joan is saying that this is happening in other countries where there's a single payer system, and these negotiations are taking place. I don't know if this is, this is in fact happening in other countries, but you may know.
So again, I would just go back to, we believe that, private industry and restoring competition to that market is really what is best in terms of driving affordability and making sure, again, at the end of the day, that there is lots of choice for, patients and, individuals that need pharmacy care. So really utilizing, private industry as that negotiation tool and restoring all of the things that we talked about in terms of bringing competition back to the market. All of those things are, again, will drive down price. Again, we can continue to believe that more competition will improve all of those things.
We are out of time, and I think this is a good time to end, but I want to give Dana the last word. Ma'am, you mentioned that you really want to go sit down with Senator Sinema. If you do get a chance to sit down with her, what will you tell her?
I mean, I just would probably give her some of the opportunities to hear some of our survey results of constituents. And then more than that, I would actually listen to her. I want to know where she's coming from. I want her to walk us through how she's making decisions on such a very important issue that has such a long lasting impact, not only on Arizonans, but the rest of the country. And her vote is absolutely, and her voice and her negotiation skills is absolutely critical.
Thank you for that. Dana, Miranda, Lee, Will, thank you for your time. Appreciate it. To our viewers and to our listeners, we will post a recording of this video on our website. And once we have that available, I will let everybody know. So if you or your friends missed this morning scoop, they can go ahead and watch it on demand. ARP Arizona, thank you again for sponsoring. And I guess I'll say have fun and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Luigi.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye. Well done, everyone.